Thank you all for your selfless efforts in helping us with all we've accomplished so far and trying to keep SCTLD out of sister islands. And also, I want to also stress the importance of how important it is to actually disinfect gear. I mean, I thank you all for your efforts with that, but also the continued efforts that we would need to at least try and control that, because really what we're trying to do is control those aspects that we can and mitigate those we can't. As Tammi and I connect the dots in Grand Cayman, I probably said this to you all before, it just more and more evident the fact that the spread, once they establish the spread, is usually linear. However, where it pops up other places, there's a correlation with divers and dive equipment. So that being said, I ask for the continued effort in sterilizing gear, more so on people that arrive from internationally or from Grand Cayman. That initial first dive before they get in the water is to disinfect their gear, which will go a long ways in helping us keep it out of Cayman Brac and sister islands in general. With that being said, we're going to go on to the presentation, and I can't thank you all enough for your efforts with the surveillance of towing behind the boat, because we can't be there and do that, but that's a real important part in keeping an idea and that it's not in the sister islands as yet, and the continued effort with that is greatly appreciated. The talk today that Tammi is going to give the majority of it is about an update on three aspects. She's going to give the objective of this meeting here is she's going to give an update on the regional response that we're all mounting against this coral disease, and she's going to highlight the DOE's response to SCTLD. And then she's going to talk more about future planning, what's down the road and how we think we should be moving and planning ahead should this even reach the sister islands. We're planning for Grand Cayman, and this planning is also on a regional basis of how we confront this disease and how we mitigate going forward with our coral reefs. So with that, I want to thank everyone again for all their efforts and ask that you continue with them. It's greatly appreciated. And I'll turn it over to Tammi now, who's going to pick up and give you all the updates on the stony coral tissue loss disease. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for making it to this meeting today, this afternoon, on this cold afternoon as the cold front continues. I just wanted to ask everyone if you could please mute your microphone if you haven't already, just to make sure there's not any interference in the audio. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, as Croy mentioned, is an update on the regional response to stony coral tissue loss disease. What is happening in the rest of the region? So from what we know, there are 20 countries or territories that have stony coral tissue loss disease present on their reefs. So these are the countries that we know about, the ones that have actually uploaded their information to this website at AGRA. And there's 19 of those countries that are actively monitoring for the disease. There's 20 of the countries, so all the countries that we know of are educating and providing outreach to the country. And there's 11 of these countries that are actually providing treatments to the stony coral tissue loss disease infected coral colonies. So there are some regions which is likely that the disease is there, but they haven't been reporting, such as Jamaica and Cuba. So what is the pathogen and how is it transmitting? So researchers have still been unable to define what the pathogen is. Evidence still suggests it's bacterial based because we're having success with antibiotics, and there has been evidence of bacteria that is present in certain in the lesion area in comparison to the healthy tissue, and in the water on healthy sites versus unaffected sites and infected sites. However, new findings suggest that it's likely to be a viral pathogen that is affecting the coral and disrupting the coral zooxanthellae symbiosis. So they think that it's a virus that's affecting the tiny little algae that lives in the coral cells that provides the coral with its color and more than 80% of its energy and nutrients. And then it's a breakdown whether that algae dies, which really leads to the tissue from the coral that dies, whether it leads to the zooxanthellae producing some kind of toxin. And we just have the first puzzle piece towards finding out exactly how that interaction works, whether the viruses are dormant in there already, whether they infect it at a later date. All these questions are looking to be answered, hopefully in the near future, as more evidence is found. Evidence suggests that there's multiple modes of transmission, which include touch, water circulation, fish predation. These are ones that I've given on an earlier presentation, but there's some new examples such as sediments and biofilms, which form in boat villages and ballast water, I believe, as well. So these are new. There's a lot of new research going into these areas to see whether the disease can be transmitted on those surfaces. Dive gear and boat villages, as Croy mentioned, it's becoming more and more compelling that the disease is spread in that way, just from the way that it's moved around Grand Cayman and how it's jumped large distances around the region. So there is 20 plus species of coral that are infected by this coral disease. Evidence suggests that there's more, with some of the more cryptic corals as well. And Turks and Caicos, they have mentioned that they've seen 30 plus species infected by this disease. So as mentioned in previous presentations, and I know this team is very aware, the loss of coral density, species diversity affects the overall coral reef health and can have catastrophic impacts on the ecosystem services that they provide. So the ecosystem services are things like storm protection, food security for thousands of reef creatures that are present on the reef that use this coral, the coral for homes, and also for our tourism industry, which is a big part of our island's economy. So the disease arrived in Grand Cayman in June 2020 at a site called Penny's Arch. The first thing we did, which most of you guys will remember, is we did boat tours around the islands. And this was to find out whether the disease was isolated to the north area where the dive site was, or whether it was somewhere else on the islands as well. So because we didn't know how it was transmitted, because we don't know how it got there in the first place, this was an important question to answer. And from the results of the surveys, we were able to say quite confidently that it was isolated to that northern area in the middle of Grand Cayman, and in that it wasn't present in the sister islands. So stony coral tissue loss disease spread in a linear fashion around Grand Cayman. When we say linear, we mean that it traveled both east and west from the original source that it was found, the original dive site area that it was firstly found. It did start to jump at certain times, and this is some of the information or the observational evidence that we have of it possibly being transferred by either boat bilges or dive gear, because it was around about the same time that we opened up those sites to diving again, when we had recommended that divers did not dive that area. But once the area became more accessible for shore diving, it seemed to be around about the same time that it started sporadically jumping around the island. The most compelling evidence was in June 2021, when it appeared on Armchair Reef, which is right down on the southwest of Grand Cayman, which was miles away from both of the leading edge. So we create these maps by doing the boat tows at the leading edge, and we did that every month while the disease traveled around Grand Cayman. And we found the disease on that dive site when there was only 4 to 8 corals infected at that site. And because it was miles away from the leading edges, why did it turn up there? And it happened to be on an area where there was a dive site and there was shore diving access, and we didn't have any of the signage or any of the disinfectant stations at that area. So it's just another piece of evidence. We can't say for certain because there's no data as of yet. There are people looking into this in the States to find out whether dive gear is possible as a vector. And so hopefully we'll know more about this in later this year. But the observational data for me is very compelling. So November 2021, stony coral tissue loss disease had circumnavigated the whole island. And as of October time, we also, you guys helped with our tours around Little Cayman and the Brac. So thank you all very much who was able to help with that effort, especially going all the way to Little Cayman, because we had a boat down over there and we couldn't, the Little Cayman Sisters Islands team couldn't assist with that effort. But again, we're quite confident that it's not on the sister islands yet, but we'd like to keep up to date and do more tows just so that when it does appear, we can react as efficiently and effectively as possible. Even though the disease is around the entirety of Grand Cayman, we are still recommending to disinfect your dive gear, because although the disease may technically be present in all the water around Grand Cayman, there's still a likelihood that you can transfer more of the pathogen from diving a heavily infected site and then diving a less infected site. So things like possibly touching a coral by accident, or increasing the viral loading from your gear being in more contaminated water than less contaminated water when you go for your next dive. So from the guidance from experts in the US, we're continuing to push for disinfecting, and we're trying really hard to push for disinfecting between the islands as well. So our fate tracking experiment, where we tagged 170 corals across 2 sites, revealed a lot of information about how this disease transfers from species to species, and roughly what death rates we'll be seeing from these 20 to 30 species that are infected by the disease. And our results suggest, similar to what had been seen in other regions, that once a colony is infected, it does die within weeks to months, and that just depends on the size of the colony and what species it is. Some species are more susceptible than others, and they'll die in a couple of weeks, whereas this large brain coral at the bottom here took 4 months to die. So there was a lot of tissue, and it seems to be slower progressing on this species. The corals on the right hand side here are examples of corals that we tagged 7 of each of these species, and all of the tagged corals of this species died completely, which extrapolated suggests 100% mortality of that species. And the rest was about 60 to 100% mortality across 10 species. So this mirrors what has been seen in Florida and other areas. So the first treatment that we tried to use wasn't really a treatment, it was coral removal. And we did this to try and limit the pathogen load in the environment. So if a disease turns up on the reef, how do you slow it down? How do you try to limit the pathogen and slow down the spread while new treatments become available? So we removed coral from an area, and we also tried to remove the highly susceptible species from an area. So from previous presentations, you might remember that the way that this disease spreads is it initially infects the highly susceptible species, then it moves on to the intermediately susceptible species, and then it moves on to the lowly susceptible species, or the least infected species. So it has a way of moving once it's on the reef from coral to coral. And when we did our boat tows, we never found any brain corals infected before we found maize coral, elliptical star, and smooth flower coral infected. So they were the first ones that seemed to light the fire and jump great distances. And then afterwards, the brain corals and the orbicellas, the star corals would then start to become infected. So the idea was to remove those highly susceptible species in the hope that it would slow down the disease spread. And if we created a big enough gap, then perhaps it would stop the disease completely. We didn't know what it would do because no other country has tried this. And it also created a nursery in Barker's area where we have some of these species still alive that we've been treating with antibiotics, and they're still healthy. So it's turned into a different kind of experiment now. But unfortunately, it did seem to slow down the progression along with the coral removal. But eventually, the disease did go past the barrier that we made. So it was worth trying, but it wasn't a silver bullet like we hoped it would be. So as of January 2021, a new treatment became on the market, which is a specialized antibiotic paste. So this is an amoxicillin antibiotic that we use, and it gets put into an ointment from Ocean Alchemist, and together you can apply this directly onto a coral in the water, and the chances of it stopping the lesion are very high. So these are some examples of what corals look like once the antibiotic's been applied and when the disease is no longer active. This is currently the most effective treatment option available, but we're keeping our eyes and ears open for any other more successful treatments to come on the market, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So the antibiotic effectiveness is, like I said, it's pretty high. Like places like Florida have published articles that show more than 90% effectiveness when they treat their corals. So assessing the effectiveness on the antibiotics, we decided to tag 47 coral colonies across 8 different species. And these are our preliminary results to suggest that the corals are becoming more stable and healthier over time. So just under 80% of our corals were stable in November 2021. But only time will tell whether these corals survive into the future. Because when we're treating them, we're only treating the lesion. We're not treating the entire coral. So there is a chance that new lesions will pop up on the other healthy tissue because you're only treating the exact area that is currently being infected. We reached out to the dive companies in the sister islands and in Grand Cayman to find out what the priority dive sites are for tourism in the area. So we used that information in addition to our data on coral cover and coral diversity and density from the Department of Environment's long-term research, and we picked the key areas that are most important for dive tourism and for coral coverage. So this wasn't what we initially did. Initially, we were still trying to slow down and possibly try and stop the disease, right? We were working in the areas where the disease was progressing at the leading edge from the north and the west side, the north and the east side at that point. And it did seem to work. But it meant that we were treating a moving target. So we would start on one dive site and then move with the disease. So now our approach is to heavily focus on these areas where you can see with the circles. This is an approximate area. It's like one dive site in that circle, and really treat it over time. So we're saving all species at all different levels of how this disease progresses in the reef. We have created strike teams. The Department of Environment has a team of 10 people in Grand Cayman. And they're out every single day doing treatments on these dive sites, and watching the progression and monitoring the efforts over time. We have sister island strike teams where we've tried our best to share our local knowledge so far, and we'll be working really hard in the next few months to prepare people for if and when this disease does get here, and what we can do in the sister islands and what we can do about it. We have a team in Grand Cayman on the east side as well. These sites are quite hard for us to access, so we have a team of roughly the same amount of people who are also going out and treating a number of dive sites on the east side of Grand Cayman. And that's Ocean Frontiers and Reef Renewal Cayman. We are working with regional and international collaborators, particularly for coral sampling. We've sampled over 1,000 corals to try and gain more insight into the disease dynamics and how it works on a cellular level. So hopefully when the experiments are run in the US, they'll be able to give us much more insight on what the virus is, how it is transmitting, how it affects the coral, and then possibly how can we treat it. And you never know, maybe there could be a cure that comes from this work, which is really exciting. Decontamination guidelines, as I mentioned, we're still recommending this in Grand Cayman. And as Croy said, thank you guys so much for your continued support and understanding with what needs to be done to protect the Brac and in Little Cayman as well. We're very convinced that dive gear is a vector, and boat bilges as well, possibly. So we're trying to reduce the human spread, right? Where there could be a chance that it appears on the sister islands randomly in the currents, or how we can't say for sure how it got to Grand Cayman in the first place, but we can do our best to control the areas that are within our reach. We can control who gets a dive tank on Cayman Brac and how they disinfect their dive gear before they go in the water. So I understand that it's a lot more to add into your day, into your routine, and it's a pain, and we're anything that we can help to support you guys, and whether we need to provide guests with information before they come to islands so that they know all about it before they're asked to rinse their dive gear and things like that. We're happy to talk about that, and hopefully we can have some good discussions about that today. All the guidelines are still true. We have those 3 decontamination guidelines printouts where you disinfect your gear. It has to be soaking for 10 minutes. You need to make sure that you put it into your BCD. You need to make sure that you wash it off afterwards before it goes in the water. All those guidelines are exactly the same. They haven't changed. In the future, we might change what the disinfectant is. It's an ammonium-based disinfectant that we're advising to use just now, but there might be something that comes on the market soon that we're in contact with that could be a different, more less expensive disinfectant for this job. And I just wanted to say that this is supported by PhDiva Diver Foundation, Coral Foundation. So she's been supplying funds for buying all the Virobac and the other ammonium-based disinfectant products that we've been using. in the sister islands and in Grand Cayman. For education and outreach, we've trained over 150 volunteers in Grand, and they come and go as everybody does, whether they've got new jobs. So we are working with a core team, but we're also working with dedicated individuals that are part of the community on island. And this also includes yourself. You've all been part of the training. We're hoping to get little certificates at some point, so that once you're trained and you've had experience in the water with the amoxicillin and the treatments, then you can possibly have an identification card, so people know that you've been trained and are ready to go. So the training involves the history of thorny coral tissue loss disease, the identification of the disease and a response, coral disease identification, treatment options, and coral identification. I guess this is kind of like a fifth presentation for a general update. We've had over 100 presentations and meetings targeting key stakeholders over the past year and a half, which takes, oh, my internet was unstable there. Did you still hear that? Anyone's there? Maybe you can give me a quick thumbs up if you could hear me. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, Tammy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
We can hear you.
Perfect. I will continue. Sorry about that. Just wanted to double check. So yes, this is continuing. We will continue to give presentations and spread the word. And we are also trying really hard to host an event to distribute all of the information, try to get people to know corals more so that they care more about corals, and involving all the local organizations that have an association with coral reefs and why, and just communicating why they're important. And also as a way that we can disseminate all the data that we've gathered over the last year and a half, so that we can communicate exactly what's happening through time to the whole community, and not just key stakeholders in areas. So this was meant to be in November, and it was meant to be in February, but I do have some sad news that it doesn't look like it's going to be this month either. As you guys are aware, the community spread of COVID-19 and Omicron is still quite rapid. So it's not the best time for an event like this, unfortunately, especially a government-led event. So we are hoping that we can make a COVID-friendly event. We have some ideas of possibly doing it in an area where it's there for 2 weeks, and you can come over the 2-week period at different intervals to see it, so that we're not promoting a large gathering at this time. And it's also something that we are really still passionate about doing in the future. It's just not possible at the moment, unfortunately. But we do believe that it's necessary to do it. Future planning and emerging treatments. We are just about to start sampling for probiotics. So this is a treatment that I mentioned earlier or last year, that, you know, if you take healthy coral bacteria from the mucus layer, you can possibly give that to the coral or to a coral that's infected, and it will make it more resilient and stop the disease progressing. So just like you would take a yogurt to stimulate your healthy gut bacteria, that's a similar kind of strategy. It promotes healing. So this has shown effective. It's still not really a silver bullet, because you have to go down there with a weighted bag, and inject the healthy bacteria in, and you have to culture the bacteria in a lab. So it takes a lot of time, and you're treating corals one by one. But there is some interesting results which show that after the bag's released, they've seen some insight that the corals in the surrounding area are also not becoming infected. So it's still early days, and this isn't published work, I don't believe, but it's a sign in the right direction, we hope. There's also other coral cures that are coming on the market, none that are available at the moment, but they're going through tests, and we've been assured that we'll be one of the first countries that can move forward with these new treatments if they do hold promise. We are thinking heavily about reef restoration in the future as well. This is a lot of where the US is right now. They're using their coral nurseries and their aquaria to help propagate corals into areas where the disease was, and assessing whether they stay alive through time. There's some interesting results coming from there. We don't really have aquaria facilities in the Cayman Islands, so we're looking into options such as ex situ nurseries, where we can provide shade and we can keep a genetic stock of the corals and keep them there through time. There's also microfragmentation, which is when you cut the corals into tiny little pieces and they grow pretty rapidly when they do that, and they found that recently, and it's a technique that's been taken on by many countries of the Caribbean, and it's also an efficient way to store corals because they take up less space when they're tiny. Cryopreservation is another technique. You can actually freeze like a chunk of coral and then thaw it at a later date, and it will continue to grow. But they've also been taking eggs, so gametes when corals spawn, and keeping them like on a little slide and freezing them at freezing cold temperatures, and then at the later date they can actually control the eggs and the sperm and rear coral larvae in situ. So again, that's all things that need aquaria, but it's a way that in the future we can help corals adapt in the face of diseases like this. So in summary, our method tree looks similar to what it did last year, that we're continuing to do research on the epidemiological side of this disease, sending samples to the US and helping provide data for new treatments to become available. We're contacting the US partners and the UK partners who are supporting us with funding. And those conversations happen bi-weekly, and we're always moving ahead with the best response possible. We are thinking about having more strike teams, possibly on the west side of Grand Cayman. But this is just a way that we can treat more of the reef and have people more involved when they go diving. And data management is a big part, because that's when we take all of this analysis and when we monitor how the reefs are reacting. It's very important to record everything that we see so that we could make the best informed decisions for our policy and management. Future planning for the disease, mainly restoration, but also new treatments that become available, where it's a dynamic and always changing project. So we're continuing to assess our response as much as possible. So we'd like to say thank you, especially to our partners in the sister islands who have helped heavily with the disinfectant. Like I'm pretty stunned that it hasn't reached there, and I'm really happy about that. And I think it is because of the efforts that we are doing to disinfect dive gear. It jumped great distances within the US and within other countries in the Caribbean, like distances that are similar to what Grand Cayman is from Little Cayman. So it's a wonder why it hasn't reached the sister islands yet, but we'd like to keep it that way, and we'd like to commend you all for your efforts in doing this, and hopefully we can have some good discussions on where we stand and what is needed from our end, and how we can move forward to help safeguard Cayman Brac and and Little Cayman. NOAA and AGRA are two of our partners from the US who are involved heavily in the response to stony coral tissue loss disease. Because the US has had the disease the longest, there's a lot of data that comes from there, but also from our partners in the overseas territories and from funding sources both on island and Darwin, JNCC, the UK government, DEFRA. They've all been involved in making this whole project possible. So thank you to everyone involved. And this doesn't have all of our partners on Grand Cayman, but I need a completely new slide for that. So this is just for you guys this time. So thank you for listening, and we can start going through questions. I haven't seen any in the chat, so I'm guessing we'll just have a conversation now if you guys have any questions.